Welcome back to the guided video tour of this document, the Timeline.pdf spreadsheet. In the last video, we covered the time from when Abram was 75 years old and he left Haran until Jacob was 130 years old and they entered Egypt. In this video, we'll cover the remaining 215 years, which end with Moses leading the Israelites out of the land of Egypt, and then a few months later he goes up on Mount Sinai and receives the 10 Commandments. We can quickly verify both 215-year sections because Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran, and then 25 years later he was 100 years old and Isaac was born. Then 60 years later, Isaac was 60 years old and Jacob was born, and then 130 years later, Jacob was 130 years old and they entered Egypt. 215 years. So now we know that they were in Egypt for the remaining 215 years because the 430-year section is accurate to the very day. It's a common misunderstanding that Israel was in Egypt for 430 years, but the precise chronology of the first 215 years, along with the verification that we get from the 400-year span, assure us that Israel was in Egypt for precisely 215 years. The ages of Kohath and Amram also verify that Israel could not have been in Egypt 430 years, and that's because Kohath is listed with those that entered Egypt, and his son Amram is listed with those that came out of Egypt. Kohath lived to 133 years old, and his son Amram lived to 137 years old. So the maximum amount of time in Egypt has to be less than their combined ages of 270 years. We're not told when Kohath was born, so we place him in the middle of the range of possible years, 14 years before entering Egypt, and 14 years after his father Levi was 15 years old, and we give him a plus or minus of 14 years. It was most likely that Kohath was born a little closer to when they entered Egypt, but we really don't need to speculate because Kohath is not used to reconcile the timeline. He and his son Amram merely show that 215 years in Egypt was possible and that 430 years in Egypt was not possible. So as we enter the time in Egypt, we can see that 17 years later, Jacob died at the age of 147. And we see the year that Joseph died at 110 years old. And we can see where Levi died at 137. We can take a bird's eye view of this 215 years. Here's the 7 years of famine, and this is the year they entered Egypt. This is Kohath in yellow, and Amram in gray, and this is the year of the Exodus. We give Amram a plus or minus of 5 years because, like Kohath, we're never told how old they are at any known event on the timeline. So Kohath and Amram are not anchored to the timeline. Instead, they are constrained to a certain range of years. In the next section, we'll see something similar with Joshua and Caleb. We're told that Joshua lived to 110 years old, but we have no way of anchoring him to the timeline by knowing his age at a known event. For Joshua, we'll use the parameters in Scripture and give him a plus or minus of 5 years, as we'll see later. Caleb, on the other hand, we're given his age at 2 different points that are crucial in verifying the accuracy of the timeline. We can anchor Moses to the timeline not by knowing when he was born, but by knowing he was 80 years old at the Exodus. The Exodus is already anchored to the timeline, right down to the day, so knowing Moses' age at the Exodus, we can know his age at every other point on the timeline as well. So we know for sure that Moses was 40 years old in the 757th year after the flood, but we don't know for sure that this was the year that he fled to Midian. And that's because the Old Testament never tells us how old he was when he fled. This number comes from what Stephen says in Acts chapter 7. And even though it doesn't contradict the Old Testament like some of Stephen's other statements do, it does add to what's revealed in the Old Testament. So it's important to recognize that this statement did not originate from the Bible. As we've already covered in the last 2 videos of this series, and in the Oral Torah video linked here, Stephen is quoting from both the written Torah, or the Old Testament, and the Oral Torah in his defense trial where he is accused of blaspheming both the written and oral Torah. The Oral Torah contained many stories called Aggadah that are fictional. some of which have been quoted by Stephen and mistaken as actual history. Moses being 40 years old when he fled is one such case, although it hasn't been problematic because it doesn't stand out as a contradiction. It merely adds information and can go undetected if the reader is not familiar enough with the Old Testament. As we'll see in the next video, Caleb is anchored to the timeline when he's 40 years old, and so that's how we'll know that he's 1 year old in year 759. So the 430-year sojourn ends in year 797 from the flood, in the first month on the 15th day. As we learned in the third video of this series, Egypt's calendar had 365 days with no leap year to correct for seasonal drift. After 215 years in Egypt, God puts Israel back onto the lunar calendar, the same calendar used throughout Mesopotamia after the dispersion at Babel about 100 years after the flood. This is the calendar that we will use through the remainder of this spreadsheet and even past the time of Christ through the time of the apostles in the book of Acts. If we remember from the third video in this series, the system of dating years as BC and AD did not start immediately after the birth of Christ. The BC dating system was not devised until 525 AD, and it was not widely in use until after 800 AD. In spite of this, many chronologists and historians base their timelines and make their calculations using BC years. This causes many problems because the Julian and Gregorian calendars do not match up precisely to the lunar calendar. Also, no calendar is static, meaning that the starting points of all calendars have some amount of variance in relation to the spring equinox from year to year. This makes it virtually impossible to make repeated, accurate conversions from the lunar calendar into BC years. The Mesopotamian Chronicles as well as the Holy Bible both use the lunar calendar, so that's what we'll use too. At the time of the Exodus, the first month was named Aviv, and it would later be called Nisan. Sometimes we're given the name of the month, other times just the number, like here with the first month. Then when they left Elim in the second month, and then at Mount Sinai in the third month. Along with months being identified, we're also given many seasonal clues that help us pinpoint chronology. We were introduced to this in the last video when Reuben found mandrakes in the field during the days of wheat harvest. Wheat harvest is in the spring, so that gave us more clarification as to when Jacob's 12 kids were born during those 7 years. Also, we know which year Jacob left Haran after spending 20 years there, but since we're told that Laban was shearing his sheep, we also know what part of the year, since sheep shearing is in the spring. By counting off the 430 years on this spreadsheet with each row representing a year, we know that the Exodus was in the 797th year after the flood, and we know it was right after the 10th plague on the 15th day of the first month. We're not told when the plague started, but at the time of the 7th plague, we're told that the barley was in Aviv, the flax was in bud, and the wheat, which ripened later, was still dark and not harmed. So by referencing our agriculture calendar, we can see that the 7th plague happened in the 12th month in the 796th year from the flood, and the 10th plague happened in the first month of the next year. But if we convert the years to BC, the first month of the BC year is January in the winter, not Aviv or Nisan in the spring. This is confusing because the 7th plague was at the end of year 796, and the Exodus was at the beginning of year 797. But when converted to BC, both events happened in 1480 BC because January 1st is over here in the winter of 796. If we have an event that we know happened in a certain year, but we don't know the specific month, we won't know which BC year to assign to it without knowing which side of January 1st it falls on. This is the case for when Assyria took the city of Samaria. Even though we know the exact lunar year and can synchronize it to the 2nd year of Sargon, king of Assyria, and the 6th year of Hezekiah, king of Judah, and the 9th year of Hoshea, king of Israel, the 23rd year of Humba-Nekas, king of Elam, and the 2nd year of Merodach-Baladan, king of Babylon, even with these 5 synchronisms, we are unable to accurately assign a BC year to the event, because we don't know the month, nor can we exclude winter as the season. And since we don't know which side of January 1st it happened, we don't know if it was 720 or 719 BC. Well, this concludes the 430-year section of the timeline. In the next video, before we start the next section, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about the pharaohs that we've encountered so far. We'll look at the chronology used by Egyptologists and other scholars to see why it's been so difficult to assign names to the pharaohs of Abraham, Joseph, and Moses. We'll also see how this Timeline PDF spreadsheet could be a step in the right direction for solving the mystery. You can download this printable chart as well as the agriculture calendar by clicking the links in the description of this video. A link is also provided to the Timeline PDF spreadsheet and to our Pinterest site where you can access more charts and resources. May God bless you in your studies, and we'll see you here next time.